Hey, welcome back. Hope you're doing well. Got a little something on here. Take that off. But wanted to talk to you a little bit about today about a little trip that I took. I went to Natchez, Mississippi, and in one of my earlier videos I spoke about Natchez. But this is rather than being a economic story or a familial story, this is about uh, a mockingbird up there. Show you where I'm at. See that? Anyway, this is about a church. Now, I went down there 2 days ago thinking that I was going to see one church, which was St. Mary's Basilica, which it used to be a cathedral, but for the Catholic folks, they can only have, in their organization, they can only have one cathedral, and they made the one that they have in the diocese in Jackson, Mississippi, their cathedral. So this one that I'm talking about became a basilica. But anyway, I thought I was gonna see that one, which is a historic and a architectural wonder and something to see. But the trip turned into more. I'll tell you a little bit about it. Now, I love history, and these were some historical things that were new to me, even though I've looked at and studied a lot of American history and also Southern history, uh, and also pre and Civil War history and before. Uh, but anyway, to make a long story short, uh, went down there with the family, went down there to look at the church and to see some other things there. Well, we went there and we had lunch at the fellowship hall. We were with a group of other folks that were coming from church to look at the same stuff. We went to the, I guess, the fellowship hall or something like that, you might say, and they had a little bit of lunch prepared for us. It wasn't anything spectacular, but it was something to eat. And then we were told that we would move as a group down to a place where there was a kind of a photo gallery from a man that was a professional photographer that took his pictures on glass slides, which there's a lot of technology and improvements that came along the way in the field of photography. But this man was taking his pictures, I believe, probably 1850 to the 1880s, maybe 1885, something like that. And that they had taken the glass slides and the different ways that he had taken the pictures and blown them up and put them into a gallery, really. And that the gallery was inside a Presbyterian church. Well, we walked down there from the fellowship hall, which was only about 5 blocks, something like that. And it was hot, let me tell you. In the summertime, it gets hot in that part of the country. Hot for sure. But we gathered up everybody and we walked down there and we went in and you couldn't tell really initially, but we were going in the side door of this Presbyterian church. Well, we went in there and the pictures and the photos. I don't know what size I'm not a photography expert. I don't know what size the glass slides were originally, but they were blown up into photographs that were probably 14 by 17 or even larger. A lot of the pictures were of women in dresses of the time, and to me they looked like advertisement pieces, to sell dresses or something like that, uh, showing the fashion of the day. And to be honest, as a guy, that was a little bit boring for me, but the photographs were very good. He did a good job. And then I went on to the next room, and there was a lot of pictures of river boats and the big paddle wheelers, like you may have seen pictures of in the past. But these pictures were very well done, and it captured, instead of just a landscape or a building or in this case a boat, it showed people in the picture in the normal clothes of the day, and what it looked like right there, and also interior pictures of the river boats and the cabins and the parlors and stuff that were on these boats, and particularly one called the HM White, which is big, and if you rode on that one, you were a baller for sure. But anyway, so look through all that, and then there was a little side door in the room that opened up into the church, and I didn't realize that until I looked out the door. But there was a little gallery right there, a little, like not a photo gallery like we were in, but like a balcony in the sanctuary of the church. Well, the woman that was there at the church, this was free. This art collection, I guess you could say, of these pictures, it was free. There was no charge, and it was worth admission, but they didn't charge. And but the woman explained that the church was built in 1830, and it's a Presbyterian church, and it was built in 1830. And there was, in another room in there, in that same photo gallery and art gallery that they had there, showing just a very, very, kind of man on the street pictures, that, you know storefronts and street venues, that you could see wagons tied up and people hanging around out in front of the stores. But there was another room in there that was telling a little bit about the church, and I'm gonna tell you a little bit about it from what I recall. I thought it was real interesting. Well, in spite of all my studies and things that I've done in the past, I didn't know, and I just found out not too long ago, that it was illegal for slaves in the American South to have their own church. I had always been under the impression and believed that they could, maybe on the plantation or somewhere off in the woods somewhere, that they'd be allowed to do that. But I found out not too long ago that it was actually illegal. Well, the way that, if you had been a slave at that time, the way that you would have been able to attend church would be something like what I'm about to describe. Now, sadly, if your owner, I know that's terrible, but the owner of the plantation and the place that you lived, for some reason, if this family or this man took an interest in your religious education, which, believe it or not, a lot of them did. I know it seems odd. It seems odd to me too, but they wanted them to have some kind of religious upbringing. Like I said, for what reason, I don't really know. But you had a couple of different options. You could teach them yourself and have something kind of like a Bible school or Sunday school or something like that in the barn or outside somewhere. Some people built little chapels on the plantation to do those kinds of things. And some of them would build a church for their slaves so they could have church. But as far as like the slaves just deciding that they were just going to go do church somewhere, that apparently that was against the law, and I didn't know that. But anyway, so back to this church. Well, that was the law at the time, and they had built this church in 1830. Now let me back up just a little bit. Now, this church is the First Presbyterian Church in Natchez, Mississippi. Well, even though this thing is big and old, 1830, it wasn't the first one there. There was another one there before that was the same folks in the same church, and it was from 1812. Okay, and the architect that built it was a man named James Hardy. Okay, well, I don't know why, but they decided maybe they didn't fit in there anymore or something. But they decided they wanted to make a bigger church or a new one or something, and so they burned that one to the ground. And then they leveled it all off and started building the one that they got now on top of the same spot. There's a bird up there. He's got a lot to say today. But anyway, so they started building on this spot, and the church that they built, uh, it's big. It's got a large sanctuary. I don't know how many people it would house. The interior of it, the wood is mostly painted white, and it's kind of sparse. I think that I'm not an architectural expert, but I think it might be the federal style. But anyway, when they built the church, they built something like a balcony that they called a gallery that was above and behind the regular congregation, which I guess had been the white folks. And that gallery was for the slaves, should they choose or want to. They could go there and attend church and sit up there in that gallery. And they built that for them. Well, for whatever reason, now you can put your thinking cap on and try to come up with what it might be. But for whatever reason, the slaves that were around there, they took a liking to these Presbyterian folks and they started attending church. And they filled up that gallery. And they attended regularly on Sunday and they heard preaching. Well, the Presbyterian congregation, the regular congregation, and the slave congregation here that was getting together in this gallery, they seem to have taken a real liking and a care for one another, and it grew to where they couldn't fit in that gallery, and they remodeled the church in 1859. And I don't know why, but for some reason, the ceiling in there used to have some really ornate, beautiful painting on the ceiling. And I don't know why, but for some reason, painted over all of that with a pastel gray. I don't know why they did that. But in addition to doing that and some other improvements to the church, they installed gas lighting and they brought a little bit of electricity to the building. And that gallery that they had that was for the slaves, they built that all the way down both sides, all the way down the length of the building to accommodate more of these slaves. Well, this went on, and of course, that was 1859. Of course, then here comes the war, so everything was different. Uh, well, during the war, they still continued having services and all, but for one reason or another, the congregation as a whole decided that they wanted to have something that was only for them, just so they could have some privacy in their own worship. So these same Presbyterians, they built a brick structure like very like a block away, maybe something like that. And it was specifically for them to have their own church and their own worship services in there. And I believe that that was that room that I was in was a part of that building. I could be wrong, but it was right there with them. But they did that, and they paid for that, and they did all that on behalf of these slaves, so that I guess they would have an opportunity for salvation. I guess that was the thinking, and wanted the betterment of some folks that didn't have a lot of avenues to better themselves, you might say. Very limited, as you might imagine. But they built that brick church next to theirs and let them have their services. And the guy that would do the ministering or the preaching, from what I see, he would have been a white man that was a minister or a pastor of the Presbyterian denomination. And on Sunday, when they would assemble, which church means assembly, that's what that means. Ecclesia. It's Greek, it means assembly. It's not a building, it's a group of people. But when they would get in there, I guess this white man, he would give a sermon to them and care for them. And during the week, uh, also, as I mentioned earlier, if you had a plantation and you cared about their religious education, you could have a man like this come out to your property and pray for them and look after the flock, you might say. Well, so that same guy, he'd preach to them on Sunday, and during the week, I guess he'd go out to the plantations and look after the sick and pray for those, and maybe lend a hand where he could. And the Presbyterians and the slaves, okay, which the Civil War had passed by this time. Well, they seem to just have hit it off and just had a real good, I guess, relationship between the two groups of people until during Reconstruction, they had realized that they had more freedoms and opportunities than they did before. And they asked permission, and they said that they wanted to separate and have their own church, like, and do their own thing totally. And from what I have seen, it looks as though those same folks helped them and aided them and help them get established and set up with their own church and to do their own thing. Uh, well, interesting fact. On the ends of the pews where you would go in to sit, uh, there's doors. There's little knee-high doors, which I have never seen that before. Maybe you haven't either. But they're little knee-high doors. I don't know what that was about. But I also saw that at some point after they were, worshiping there, they, for some reason, they still owed money on the original building, the one that they burned down and built on top of in the same spot. And in an effort to pay back that debt, and I think they were successful in doing so, they rented pews. So if you were a member of their congregation, you could pay and rent a pew for your family and have a designated spot for y'all to sit. And I don't know, if that was, a flex. Maybe it was a flex. I don't know. Uh, but the stated goal of the church was to pay off that debt, and it looks as though they were successful in doing that. Well, back to this Catholic church. Well, now I saw all that, and that was just really, really intriguing. I just would have stayed there and really dove down that rabbit hole, for a while, I guess. But we had to move on. We were with this group of people, and we were going back down to the Catholic church. So we walked back down there, and it's only, uh, maybe about 4 blocks. It's not much. It was hot now, but it wasn't that far. They were close to each other. And that Presbyterian church was built facing a square that looks like they built on top of it. The square ain't there anymore. Well, we walked back down there, and I started looking at this Catholic church and see if I could uncover some history on it, since I'd have to dig on my own. So I did, and I hopped on the internet. I started looking at it. And I'm gonna tell you a little bit about that. Now, this church is way more ornate and architecturally significant than the Presbyterian church. Now, it wasn't even started to be built on until 1842, which is long, long after the Presbyterians had been worshiping every Sunday for a long time. So this church didn't come along till significantly later on in time. But when it was built, it's got these. They're not regular arches. They're the kind that kind of go up together and meet. Maybe like four lines come together to a point in the center. It's not a truncated arch. I forget what you call that. But anyway, it's got a lot of painting in it, and Catholics like a lot of statues and stuff, and it's got statues in there, and it's made out of marble and uh, different kinds of stone, and it's way more elaborate and beautiful, frankly, than the Presbyterian church. But let me back up a little bit on that. Okay. Well, the first known Catholic Mass, which the Catholics, when they get together for worship, they call that a Mass. Okay. Well, was with a guy, I want to say his name was LaSalle. He was a Frenchman, but they came down the Mississippi River from way up north, and they had a Mass, or a worship service, you might say, where they served the Eucharist or communion a little bit south of Natchez. Okay. Well, that was really the only thing that happened. Okay. And then I think in 1722, now when that guy came down the river, that was 1682. Okay. So somebody that was Catholic had came down the river long before the Presbyterians. I don't know when they originally arrived, but it looks as though this one guy came down from Lake Michigan with his party, and there was a priest with him. And you can't, in the Catholic part of Christianity, you can't just do your own worship. You have to have a priest to do that. And he happened to have one in his party. So a little bit south of Natchez, they had a Mass there in 1682. Well, flash forward just a little bit to 1722, and the French were in charge of this area, and they set up what they call a diocese, which is a religious organization of churches within the Catholic faith. And Natchez, it was considered a capital. It was a big commerce spot. There's an ancient road that's a federal road now, and the National Park Service road that goes to Natchez. And people generally, what they would do is they'd take their wares and their cotton or whatever tobacco, whatever they could grow, and take it down the river, and they'd go to Natchez or New Orleans, and they would sell that stuff and sell the boat off too for lumber, and then buy a horse and come back traveling back up to wherever it was they lived. So 1722, they set up a diocese for the Catholics, and that diocese existed just, I think, more or less just on paper and an idea, and not much else, until 1763, when the French lost the war, the French and Indian War. They lost to the British, and along in there too, the Spanish got control. And if you really want to enjoy some geopolitical events. You can look at what happened to Spanish West Florida and the Louisiana Purchase, and what happened in central and southern Mississippi and Alabama, and the whole part of what's today the state of Louisiana, and the land, that was the Louisiana Purchase. But anyway, when the Spanish were there, they built a wood frame church that was in Natchez for the Catholics to worship. And then shortly thereafter, uh, the Spanish turned over all of their land and property to the United States. Okay. Well, for some reason, I don't know why, but for some reason, that church was in dispute between the Spanish and the Americans. And it took a little bit of time before the Catholic Church got possession of that building again. But the church there, the wood frame church, I'm not sure where it is or if it exists anymore. I really would have liked to seen that. Uh, it would have been pre 1776 Spanish in Natchez, and maybe one day I'll be able to find it, but I don't know where it is. But back to what I was saying. Uh, they seemed to didn't have a priest, and they did some kind of worship there. I'm not sure what exactly, until they got some religious clerics, some priests and bishops and all, to come look after these folks, the Catholics, where they could practice their faith. Well, they it looks as though they changed bishops and priests about 4 or 5 times. Uh, but during all this time, in 1841, they uh, they said they wanted to build a church, and they commissioned the building of the church, and they laid the foundation of it in 1842. But for some reason, it took about 40 years for them to build that church. I don't know why. I don't know if it was because the architecture was difficult to do, or they didn't have skilled artisans, or maybe if it was just too expensive and they didn't have the money. I don't know. I haven't found an explanation for that. But for some reason, it took them a long, long time. So the Civil War broke out, and little side beat here. Uh, in terms of cultural things and outreach to the community, there was a group of nuns. I think there was about 3 or 4 of them, and they set up an orphanage for girls in Natchez. Okay, which, by the way, I think maybe like 17, 1740, maybe something like that. The population in Natchez was only about 1,600 white people, I guess, or Europeans, and about 500 slaves. That's it, about 2,000 people. But these nuns set up an orphanage for girls, and they started collecting girls over time that were orphaned. And the Civil War came, and when the shelling started in Natchez and started hitting Natchez from the river, river boats shooting big heavy cannons up toward the city like that. Well, the nuns all panicked and they were worried about the girls. And so they gathered up all the girls and they decided they'd run out of town. And they got word that there was a man out of town. I forget his name, but he had a plantation. And he offered and invited these nuns to bring the girls over to his plantation until, I guess, kind of the dust settled. So these 3 nuns took 109 orphan girls and took them out there to his plantation. And they stayed there in safety until, I guess, it was safe to go back. Uh-huh. Well, then the war was over and they went back, and I think that the regular Catholic folks had been having their masses in this St. Mary's building Oh no, wait, let me back up. They were still having it in that Spanish wood frame building, I believe, because the St. Mary's was under construction still at this time. But they needed or wanted money. I don't know if they needed it or if they just wanted it or what. But for some reason, I thought this was interesting. Uh, that wood frame church that the Spanish had built, they rented out the bottom floor of that church to a dry goods store, which just sounds super crazy to me. I can't imagine Catholic folks today allowing something like that or wanting it or needing it. But yeah, the bottom floor of the church was a dry goods store, and then you could go upstairs and have your mass, you know. But they got the church set up, and they were having church, and they had it where they could go in and worship at St. Mary's, this big ornate church. And the war was over, and the bishop at the time was a guy named Elder, the Catholic bishop. His last name was Elder, Elder. And Bishop Elder he seems to have been quite a personality, and he maybe he was a little bit flamboyant, you might say. But the Catholics, if you don't know it, anybody who's Catholic, they know this. But if you're not or you never seen it, when they give corporate prayers and they speak as a group, the priest will do this, or maybe a representative. But when they're listing off all the people to pray for, the first one they pray for is the Pope, and they call him the Holy Father. That's what they call him. And I think normally he's the first one that they mention is the Holy Father, Pope, whoever he is at the time. And they pretty much have always done that, I believe. Well, this Bishop Elder, when he was worshiping with everybody, he would mention the Pope just like they all do, you know. But then he would mention in his prayers Jefferson Davis, which was the president of the South. Which, you know, the war was over, but Jeff Davis was still alive and living somewhere, I think on the Mississippi coast, which wasn't far, or New Orleans. His funeral was in New Orleans. But so he would mention the Pope, and then he'd mention Jeff Davis. And I don't know if he was praying for the South to be rising again or for his health and safety, or I don't know what he was saying. But he was mentioning him in these formal prayers where everybody could hear it. Well, at a certain point, he stopped doing that because this was a Reconstruction period. The war was over, and Natchez was occupied by Union soldiers. And it was a concern that he had that he might offend some of these Union soldiers that were in his congregation. So he stopped doing that. And I get that. I think I probably would have done the same thing. So he stopped mentioning Jeff Davis in those prayers. Well, a Union general heard about it, and he went to go challenge this man, Bishop Elder. He wanted to, as they say in the South, you know, tell him how the cow ate the cabbage or some such expression like that. Uh, he wanted to give him what for or whatever you want to call it. And wherever it was that he met with him, it must have been kind of a public place and people could see because they all heard and saw what went on right there. And this Union general looked face to face with this man, this Bishop Elder, and he told him that if he was going to be mentioned Jeff Davis in his prayers like that, he needed to also mention Abraham Lincoln. Well, Bishop Elder responded to that, and he said that he admired Abraham Lincoln and he respected him, but he was not going to be doing that. Well, they had a little tit for tat going back and forth about that, and it just riled up the Union general. And I think he more or less demanded that Abraham Lincoln be included in the prayers, and the bishop flatly rejected that again. And he cited a reason. He said that this Union general was interfering in the worship of the people, and that he was representing the government, and he was out of order for that. Well, the Union general, boy, he just could not handle that. I guess maybe he was embarrassed in front of the crowd, or whatever his reasons were. But he exiled the bishop, this bishop elder, and told him he had to get out of town. And he couldn't be in Natchez anymore. And they sent him across the river to Vidalia, Louisiana, which is directly across the river from Natchez. And he went over there. I don't know what he did over there, but that was his supposed exile because this man's pride, I guess he couldn't handle being rejected by a man of God, I suppose, to be challenged as a general like that and shut down. I guess maybe that was a wound to his pride, probably. But the bishop, this elder man, the bishop, his exile didn't last very long because in about 2 months' time, or a little bit less, word got up to Washington D.C. that this had gone on, and the powers that be and the political folks and whoever was up there, they sent word back down through the army that the Union general was wrong and he had overstepped his bounds, and he was basically all the things that the bishop had told him. He was out of order and all that, and he needed to be reinstated. Well, the Union general, he complied with that order. He did as he was told, and he sent for Bishop Elder, and they brought him back across the river. And the story goes that when he was coming across back to the Mississippi side, that a group of nuns were standing on the riverbank waiting for him. So anyway, hope you like this story. I did. I enjoyed it, and I'm probably going to look in to see because I really want to know more about that wood frame church that the Spanish built. Uh, that's kind of a gray area in my studies what the Spanish did when they were here. But I hope you're doing well, and thank goodness we ain't got slaves anymore, and we can all worship together and pray for one another without, you know. Well, I hope we can pray for people without being clouded in our judgment for political reasons. Although I'm sure that still goes on. Maybe that bishop thought that he would, you know, impress some people mentioning Jeff Davis. I don't know. And it's possible that the bishop was racist, and that was the reason he was saying that. But another possible reason is because in the Orthodox Church, which comes from the original church, the Orthodox and the Catholics come from the original church. When the Orthodox have their services, when they come to that part where they give corporate prayers like that, they mention that they pray for all civil authority. So it may have simply been that bishop was just praying for civil authority and for the political class. No one knows. I wasn't there. I don't know. And I'm not trying to cast a shadow over the man's memory. But I thought all that was real interesting, particularly the renting of the pews and, uh, helping the slaves rise up and realize their rights and have their own church. And the Spanish having been there so long before everybody else. The world is just amazing. And I don't know. I guess we're always trying to conquer something. But I hope you're doing well. And until next time, y'all be good.